everyone. Please forgive the really bad lighting for this video. We're going to talk through Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. This is one of my favorite poems related to death themes, which is a very odd category of poems to think of it like that. But it's also one of my favorite poems to teach because it works so well with the three-step reading method that we're going to use in this course. So just as a refresher, for every time we have a poem or a piece of fiction, I want you to read it 3 times. The first is a very literal reading, just get through it. Find out what's happening plot-wise. Who's talking? Why are they talking? Who are they talking to? Those kind of basic fundamental plot points. Second level of your reading, so read it all the way through for plot, read it a second time, and think about figurative language. So this is when you want to pull out your metaphors, your similes, any personifications, any interesting language. If any of you remember your high school English classes, these are the things you're drawing on for the second reading. Then you do a third reading. Yay! Reading each poem 3 times. The third time is going to be your rhetorical reading. So you're looking at the bigger questions for a poem. What is it trying to say? And for this class, what does it say about death and dying? What does it say about the society in which it was produced and how they thought about death and dying? Okay, so we are going to start with Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. If you're following along on the lesson, which you should be, I've gone ahead and printed the entire poem there so you don't have to pull up on a separate sheet. Okay, so go ahead and read it all the way through the first time to yourself. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and read it through with you. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, so plot-wise, it seems pretty simple. A woman gets picked up by a man driving a carriage who's dead. I mean, she tells us that. And then they go on a bit of a carriage drive. Where to? We're not going to know until we get to our rhetorical reading. Okay, so let's talk figurative language, and we'll just go straight from the first stanza on down. Okay, carriage, the old-fashioned thing with horses. It's reflective of the vehicle over time. We drove along, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. That's kind of a weird phrase, my labor and my leisure too. So she's not doing anything, either for her own enjoyment or because she has to do it as, like a job. She's just sitting there with death, not busying herself in any way. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So the reference in the ring here is to a children's game of the time of her age. Think like Ring Around the Rosie. So they're in this carriage, they drive past the school, they see the kids playing in the schoolyard. We pass the fields of gazing grain, we pass the setting sun. So they're going which way? Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. Often when you see references to west in poems, especially in this class, they're talking about death because the sun is setting, it's going down. Or rather, he passed us because the sun is going down, death, sun sets. The symbolism here is that someone is going down just like the sun. Okay. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. So part of one of the things I ask you to do on the second reading is to look up any kind of weird words or interesting narrative devices you might be unfamiliar with. And we've got two here, gossamer and tippet, and probably tulle as well. Three, sorry. So gossamer is a fabric. It's a really thin fabric. Think almost like silk, where it's not something you want to wear on a cold night in a carriage ride, which we know it's cold, it's chill. They're starting to be quivering because it's dewy and wet. And she's wearing this really thin gown. I mean, like a nightgown, essentially. And my tippet is kind of like a shawl thing that they used to wear in Emily Dickinson's time. Only tulle, and a tulle again is a very, very thin fabric. So she's wearing clothes that are not suited to the very cold weather or the outdoor carriage ride. Working through the next stanza here, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. This is probably the trickiest part of the figurative language here, because the house in a ground, a house in a ground, it's not like a little hobbit house. It's actually far more depressing than that. So a house in the ground with a tiny little swelling where everything's underground. What is that? And death is driving the carriage. It's a grave. So they go by a grave. And this poem is taking a very dark turn. They're going by. So she can't stop for death. In the first paragraph, he picks her up. They go slowly. She puts away everything she was doing. They go by a school where kids are playing. They get passed by the setting sun. It's cold. She's shaking and quivering and chilly. They pass by a grave. This is getting dark. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horse's head were towards eternity. So the horses are pointing towards eternity. So if we think back to the idea of the death of a state, as a state that we covered in our last lesson, we see it here. So something is happening after the point of death. And one of the reasons why I like this poem is because you can read through it the first time and it makes sense. It's really easy to get the plot and the general characterizations and to know what's going on. But then as you start to pick it apart, the layers come out, and it's such a nuanced treatment of death. Okay, let's work through that third reading. So for the third time you read a poem, you're going for the rhetorical reading. So we're putting together our base understanding of plot and characterization, and we're adding in our rhetorical language. We're thinking about metaphors, we're thinking about personifications, and we're thinking about symbolism. And we're uniting those together to try to get the overall point about what this poem is saying about death and dying. So because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. When we first read this, it sounded like, okay, so she couldn't stop, so death picked her up. But as we read it and it gets more and more sinister, this is kind of a sinister stanza. Because I could not stop for death, he stopped for me. So she's being taken against her will. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So she's not doing anything anymore. She got picked up against her will, she's not doing anything. And death is being very civil and kind to her. This is a very kind and polite version of the Grim Reaper. Just determined, but not rude, not dangerous or violent. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So she's in this carriage against her will. She's stopped everything she's doing. She's being drawn past images of children, life, and grain, again, growth, life, agricultural rebirth. She's being passed over by the sun. And as she's on this kind of forced march towards the sunset and death and eternity, she gets a chill, and that she's chilled to the bone because she's not ready for death. She's not dressed for death. She couldn't stop for death. She's on this carriage against her will. She passes a grave, and then she's there for centuries. She's in the death state. So what I want you to do as you think about this poem is to realize that It presents death as this real personified, really polite English gentleman. Well, actually, I'm just assuming English because the author is and the language that's used. A very polite, a very cordial version of death, a non-violent Grim Reaper, but persistent, forceful, and the author's taken against their will. And the author, is, sad is not the right word, but both aware, and the imagery here suggests regretful, because she wasn't ready to die. So you get more out of a poem like this if you work through it slowly and you work through it in 3-step reading. And so as we look at the different poems in this lesson and really throughout the class as a whole, I want you to take them slowly, use your 3-step reading, and be prepared to do some really deep analysis.